Excellencies, distinguished delegates and guests, you are most welcome to Cuba, the land of José Martí, and we owe to him the beautiful idea that homeland is humanity. Thank you for accepting the invitation in defense of the future of the majorities that are part of this concept, that is humanity. As the Cuban foreign minister said, this is a hard summit, and I would like to apologize for all the hardships. Cuba is harassed by a blockade that is lasting for 60 decades, and all these hardships that have been reinforced. We also face the colossal challenges that are the result of the order in place, but we're not the only one. Almost 60 years ago, it was the result of difficulties that could not overcome them, and therefore we emerged as a group. We are the 77 plus China, and we are more. As you may see over the upcoming days, there are many things that are lacking, but we have a feeling of friendship, solidarity, and brotherhood, and we have enough will to feel you, make you feel at home. You're all at home.
Con la garantía de que haremos todo para que nuestras deliberaciones conduzcan.
So our deliberations should come or lead to actual results in the climate solidarity and cooperation that makes it possible our collective mission. The 77 Group plus China has the responsibility to represent in the international arena the interests of most nations worldwide. Because of different reasons, we preserve the original name, but we are many more than 77. At present, we're 174. It equals 2/3 of the member states of the United Nations, where 80% of the world population lives. This summit gives us the possibility to have a collective deliberation at the highest political level to join efforts in defense of the interests of the majorities. It helps us to conciliate positions in the face of the current challenges for development and the well-being of our peoples. But also, it is imposing questions after almost 60 years of diplomatic battle and the difficult attempt to transform the unfair rules that are ruling over international standards. We have to recall the calls from historic leaders to democratize the United Nations, the warnings by Fidel Castro that tomorrow it will be too late, and an unforgettable phrase, as Hugo Chavez said, that the presidents are moving from one summit to the next, and we're going from one abyss to the other. The Bolivarian leader favored meetings that were actually useful, out of which we could see concrete benefits for the peoples that are waiting solutions on the verge of the selfishness, those who have been cutting the pie and leaving the leftovers to us. This summit is taking place at times in which humanity has reached a scientific and technical potential that could not be foreseen decades ago, with an extraordinary capacity to generate wealth and well-being that, under conditions of greater equality, equity, and justice, could guarantee living standards that could be sustainable for almost all inhabitants in the planet.
Si coloreamos el espacio que ocupan las naciones miembros del...
And the member states of the summit in the world, we could see forces that cannot be overcome. We're more and more, we are more diverse. The South also exists, according to Uruguayan poet Mario Benedetti, because of all the time in which the North has forced the South to their interest. It's up to the South to change the rules of the games. And we cannot, you could just see the light, as José Martí said. with the right that we have to be the majority of the members of the G77, the main victims of the current multidimensional crisis suffered by the world, the cyclic lack of adjustment of trade and international finance, the abuse exchange, the scientific technological gap, the effects of climate change and the progressive destruction and the end of natural resources out of which the life on the planet depends. We demand the outstanding democratization of the international relations system. The peoples of the South are the ones that have more poverty, hunger, misery, death for curable diseases, illiteracy, human displacements, and other consequences of underdevelopment. Many of our nations are called poor when in fact they should be called impoverished nations. And we have to revert that condition in which we have been stuck as a result of colonial centuries of dependence, because the South can no longer cope with these unfortunate issues. Those who raise cities out of the blood and sweat of the nations of the South are suffering already, and they will suffer more in the future, the consequence of economic imbalances that were the result of plunder. We are traveling on the same boat, although some are VIP passengers and others are their servants. The only path that is valid so that this vessel does not end like the Titanic is cooperation, solidarity, the African philosophy of Ubuntu that understand humane progress without exclusion, where pain and hope of each and everyone is the hope of all. Excellencies, we have proposed at the topic of this summit the role of science, technology, and innovation as essential components of the political debate that is associated to development. We are doing so while we are convinced that the breakthroughs in this field are the ones that will ultimately determine when we can, and if we can attain the Sustainable Development Goals, the hunger zero in the world, health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, solution to energy issues, work, economic growth, industrialization, and social justice. I am convinced that it will not be possible either to move forward towards a sustainable living standard in harmony with the life in the planet without these premises, and it is self-evident that the transforming process towards the achievement of these objectives takes into account in one way or another the role of knowledge as the one that generates science, technology, and innovation. The time has come to put an end to international barriers, has put hurdles on the way of development, and to take advantage of factors that are so determined for the economic balance and the social balance. I'm talking about barriers that are closely related to an international economic order that is unfair and unsustainable, that takes forward conditions of privileges for developed countries and lags behind conditions of underdevelopment to the majority of humanity. Without taking into account these issues, we will be unable to reach sustainable development to which we all have the right, no matter how many goals we set. And we cannot close the immense gap that separates, on the one hand, the previous lives of a segment of a reduced amount of the population on the planet and the underdevelopment that is deepened among the big majorities. We cannot trust either that we will reach a world of peace in which we will see the end of wars and armed conflicts of all kinds. Science, technology, and innovation play a key role in fostering productivity, efficiency, the creation of added value, the humanization of working conditions, promotion of well-being, and the guarantee of human development. We are seeing the greatest scientific technological revolution in human history. Science has changed the very course of life. Man has been able to know sidereal space and develop sophisticated machines that automate even the most basic processes associated with our existence. The Internet has broken through the limits of time and space. Technological development has enabled a connected world and reduced distances of thousands of miles to a click. It has multiplied the capacities of teaching and learning, speeded up research, and endowed man with unsuspected abilities for improving our standards of living. But these possibilities are not within the reach of everyone. In this context, UNESCO has stressed that the creation and dissemination of advanced digital production (ADP) technologies worldwide remain concentrated, with minor activity in most of the emerging economies. Just 10 economies spearheading ADP technologies account for 90% of all the patents globally and 70% of the total exports directly related to these. Far from becoming tools for closing the development gap and helping overcome the injustices that overshadow mankind's very future, they tend to be weaponized for use in widening the gap, sapping the will of many of our governments, and protecting the system of exploitation and plunder that for centuries fed the wealth of the old colonial powers and condemned our nations to a subordinate role. That explains why, in the midst of the most tremendous scientific technical advance of all time, the world has regressed 3 decades as regards reducing extreme poverty with levels of hunger not witnessed since 2005. It explains why, in the so-called Third World, over 80 million children are without schooling and over 60 million have no electricity, with only 36% of the population use the Internet in the least advanced countries and the landlocked developed nations, compared with 92% in the industrialized world. Note that the average cost of a smartphone represents only 2% of the monthly income per head in America, while the corresponding statistics in South Asia is 53% and in sub-Saharan Africa 39%. It is impossible to speak of technological advance or fair access to communications in these circumstances. The energy transition is also taking place in conditions of extreme inequality, which seeks to perpetuate itself. The disproportion in energy consumption between the developed countries, 167.9 GG per person per annum, and the developing world, 56.2 GG, results from the existing economic and social divide and also ensures that this gap goes on widening. Electricity consumption in the OECD countries exceeds the world average to 35 times and that of the sub-Saharan Africa 60 times. Many of the diseases that are more prevalent in developing countries are preventable or at least treatable. The WHO, in its report on the world state of health, estimates that every year 8 million people die prematurely from curable diseases and conditions. These deaths represent around 1/3 on the annual worldwide mortality. We have the duty to try to change the rules of the game, and we will succeed only by mobilizing joint action. All or nearly all of us are trying to attract direct foreign investment as a necessary component of our development and the management of our economies. We sometimes succeed in arranging for this to be accompanied by certain technology transfer, but we know that more often than not, there is no transfer of knowledge or help with capacity building. This lack means that the developing countries find themselves in the lowest levels in the global value chain, while the research in public health, food, the environment, and other fields is very limited or deficient in systematic evaluation. This phenomenon accompanies the emigration of talent commonly referred to as the brain drain. That is to say, the practice of the most developed countries to poach the preparation and knowledge of professionals trained with much effort by the developing nations, generally entirely without support by the richest countries. This is a massive drain and a significant financial contribution by developing countries to the rich ones, much greater, by the way, than official development assistance, as a result of a migratory flow that is devastating for the underdeveloped world. Another reality is a tendency to patent everything, including life forms, and this is a practice that swells the coffers of large transnational corporations in the most powerful economies and makes the remaining economies more fragile. The rampant process of privatization of knowledge contributes to widening the gap and limits access to development. Patents are there's pressure on developing countries to introduce laws to protect intellectual property rights while conveniently forgetting that many industrialized countries develop precisely by pirating products and technology outside their geographic borders, particularly in today's developing countries. Patent applications continue to increase, and even in the midst of the pandemic in 2020, up by 1.5% and jumped in 2021 3.6% growth. Health-related technologies continue to record the fastest growth among all sectors. During 2021, trademark applications reached 3.4 million globally, up 5.5% on 2020. However, it was uneven by region. Asia received two-thirds, 67.6% of all applications filed, driven mainly by growth in China. North America, 18.5%, while in Europe it was 10.5%, Africa 0.6%, Latin America and the Caribbean 1.6%, and Oceania 0.6%, and these accounted for the lowest percentage of total applications. The gender gap in innovation persists. The numbers engaged in research increased at a rate 3 times faster, 13.7%, than the growth of the world population, 4.6%, between 2014 and 2018. Nevertheless, only one-third of the researchers are women. According to the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, men still represent the large majority of those associated with patented inventions in the world. In 2021, only 13% of the persons designated as inventors in international patent applications were women. The privatization of knowledge places limits on the circulation and recombination of knowledge. It poses limitations to progress and to scientific solutions to problems. It represents a significant barrier to development and the role that science, technology, and innovation should play in it. It exacerbates the socio-economic conditions of third world countries. Suffice it to say that in the midst of the greatest pandemic humanity has ever known, just 10 manufacturers accounted for 70% of anti-COVID-19 vaccine production. The pandemic was a starkly realistic illustration of the cost of scientific and digital exclusion, which took lives and widened the gap between North and South. As a result, developing countries had only 24 doses of vaccines per 100 inhabitants, while the corresponding number of the richest countries was almost 150. In response to the call for greater solidarity and put aside disagreements, the world ended up being absurdly more selfish. The World Health Organization has formulated the well-known 90-10 syndrome, according to which 90% of wealth research resources are devoted to diseases that cause 10% of mortality and morbidity, while those that cause 90% of mortality and morbidity receive only 10% of the resources available. In the aftermath of the pandemic, our countries have had to endure extraordinarily complex conditions, which they are still fighting hard to overcome. In top-end financial markets, the nations of the South have faced interest rates up to 8 times higher than those charged to developed countries. About 1/5 of developing countries liquidated more than 15% of their international foreign exchange reserves to cushion the pressure on domestic currencies. In 2022, 25 developing nations had to devote more than 1/5 of their total income to servicing public external debt, which is tantamount to a new form of slavery. The expense in research and development between 2014 and 2018 increased by 19.2%, outpacing the growth of the global economy, 14.6%. However, it remains highly concentrated as 93% arises in the G20 countries. The resources needed for the comprehensive solution to these problems do exist. In 2022 alone, the global military spending reached a record $2.2 trillion. How much we could do with these resources for the benefit of the South. Achieving universal and inclusive participation in the digital economy will require at least $428 billion to be invested in our country by 2030, a demand that can be met with just 19% of global military spending. However, the South remains destined to live on the crumbs that the current system has reserved for it. The International Monetary Fund financial support for the least developed countries and other low-income countries from 2020 to late November 2022 was no more than what the Coca-Cola company has spent on advertising its brand alone in the last 8 years. Meanwhile, less than 2% of the already deficient official development assistance has been dedicated to capacities in science, technology, and innovation. Estimates indicate that 9% of global military spending could finance climate change adaptation over 10 years, and 7% will be sufficient to cover the cost of universal vaccinations against the pandemic. An international financial architecture that perpetuates such disparities and forces the South to tie up financial resources and go into debt to protect itself from the instability that the system itself generates, that enlarges the pockets of the rich at the expense of the reserves of the poorest 80%, is without a doubt an architecture that is inimical to the process of our nations. It must be demolished if we really want to work for the development of the great mass of nations gathered here. Your Excellencies, it must be a priority to abolish once and for all the research paradigms that are specific to the cultural environments and perspectives of the North, and that deprive the international scientific community of considerable intellectual capital. This trend poses a premise for our nations: the urgency of restoring confidence in the most dynamic element of our societies, the human being and her capacity of creation. In these endeavors, capacity building is key to fulfilling the promise of science, technology, and innovation for sustainable development. We recognize in this regard the merit of the Global Development Initiative, promoted by the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. This is an inclusive proposal consistent with the need for a new, just, and equitable international order, which rightly places knowledge-based development at the center of the priorities of the international system where it actually belongs. Even though Cuba is a developing country bounded by great economic difficulties, it has scientific capabilities that should not be underestimated and that are part of the legacy of the historical leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, who, with foresight identify this field as a mainspring of development. We have a government management system based on science and innovation, which has become an important strength for the preservation of our sovereignty, the best expression of which was the creation of our own vaccines against COVID-19. However, for Cuba, linking knowledge to the solution of development problems is a titanic task, since such efforts are to be made in the midst of an entrenched economic, commercial, and financial blockade that translates into significant resource limitations. Just to name one example, by political decision of the United States government, many websites related to knowledge and science are specifically blocked for Cuban researchers. This is not an occasion for me to dwell on the impact of the criminal U.S. blockade and what it has on our economy, our scientific technical process, and our development with an obvious humanitarian cost. However, I must identify it as a major obstacle, despite which, due to our strong political will, Cuba has been able to achieve indisputable results in science and innovation. I invite you to discuss during this day the challenges of our nations of development, the injustices that exclude us from global process, but also the value of our unity and our rich store of knowledge. Let us focus on reflections on the pursuit of consensus, strategies, tactics, and ways of coordination. Let us put on the table all our assets. Let us maximize synergies. Let us show the value and expertise of the thousands to those who seek to present us as an amorphous mass seeking charity or handouts. Let us remember that many of the unique nations represented by the G77 and China wrote impressive pages of creativity and heroism in human history before colonization and plunder impoverished the destinies of a number of them. Let us recover that fire and spirit, traditional knowledge, creative thinking, and collective wisdom. Let us fight for a right to development, which is also the right to exist as a species. Only then will we be in a position to participate in the scientific technical revolution on an equal footing. Only then will we be able to occupy the place that is rightfully ours in the world in which they try to relegate us to the condition of mere contributors to wealth to minorities. Let us fulfill together the honorable mission of integrating and improving this world, making it fairer and more rational without the permanent threat of extinction overshadowing our dreams. Excellency, 23 years ago, at a meeting like this one, the historical leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, asserted, and I quote, "As for the Group of 77, this is not the time for begging from the developed countries or for submission, defeating or enacted divisions. This is the time to rescue back our fighting spirit, our unity and cohesion in defending our demands." 50 years ago, we were promised that one day there would no longer be a gap between developed and the underdeveloped countries. We were promised bread and justice, but today we have less and less bread and more injustice. End of quote. The typicality of these words can be construed as a defeat in terms of what this group aimed for and failed to achieve. I ask you to take it as a confirmation of the long road we have traveled together and of all the rights we have to demand the overdue changes. In tribute to those who believed and laid the foundations in the name of the people who we represent, let us see that their voices and demands are respected. There are more of us and we shall triumph. Thank you.